I've seen plenty of Democrats walk onto Fox News and immediately fall into defensive mode, but Abdul El-Sayed did the exact opposite here and completely disrupted Will Cain's entire game plan from the start. Welcome back, everybody. Hit that subscribe button, comment where you're watching from, and let me know your thoughts, because this interview turned into a full-on clash between MAGA culture war politics and real economic issues facing everyday people. Fox News thought they were going to corner Michigan Senate candidate Abdul El-Sayed, but the interview quickly turned into one of the strongest pushbacks the network has aired in a long time. Will Cain kept trying to drag the conversation into MAGA culture war talking points about immigration and extremism, but El-Sayed refused to play defense and kept redirecting the discussion toward healthcare, wages, infrastructure, and the economic struggles facing ordinary Americans. The most intense moments came when El-Sayed described ICE as a massive paramilitary force tied directly to Donald Trump and argued that fear-based immigration politics distract from real economic issues. Every time Cain tried pushing outrage narratives, El-Sayed brought the focus back to affordability, gas prices, war spending, and where government money is actually going. The interview became a live clash between two completely different political worldviews. I definitely have some thoughts on this, so stay tuned because we're about to get into it together.
Yes, I did give you quite the introduction. We start with your very own words, that you would like to abolish ICE. Now, what I would like to ask you is, ICE is simply the enforcement mechanism for democratically elected laws of the people. Now, for a party who has talked about the threat to democracy, is it your position that you do not want to see the will of the people, the democratically elected laws, enforced?
First of all, Will, you and I both know that immigration law is not criminal law. Immigration law is civil law. It's like getting a parking ticket. So the idea that we should have a paramilitary force that is weaponized on our streets to enforce civil law seems to me to be a bit over the top, particularly considering the fact that the current president is weaponizing ICE against the idea of the rule of law itself. The idea that they should just be governed simply by Stephen Miller and Donald Trump without any enforcement around basic warrant law or the Constitution itself, that to me is frustrating. Now, I want to pivot just quickly because I do want to ask you, do you pump your own gas?
Well, before we start talking about whether or not I pump my own gas, we have to
I'd like to just
follow up
ask
with
you,
your answer.
It's important.
I appreciate
$185 billion.
I appreciate the interest in having a conversation, Mr. Syed, but what I would suggest is I'm conducting this interview, and I want to ask you about your positions. My interest today is you are running for Senate. No, excuse me. You are running for Senate in the state of Michigan. What I am curious about, as you conduct a tour targeted at counties that voted for both Joe Biden and President Donald Trump, is exactly how extreme or moderate your positions might be. I'm not running for elected office, so my position on current gas prices is of immaterial to the audience. Your positions as seeking elected office are what's important. And what I would like to figure out is whether or not you believe in the rule of law. It's simply not true that immigration enforcement is simply a civil law. It is in the federal criminal code as well. It is violating the law to come in this country illegally. If you want no enforcement mechanism for it, what I see is you advocating for lawlessness. And when I see you say things like you did on your X feed, one moment, when I see things like you put on your X feed, which you did delete, like immigrants are American, refugees are American, undocumented people are American, either that or the only real Americans are Native Americans, you pick, I see you denying something like the rule of law and the concept of citizenship. And I'm curious if that's your proposal to the people of Michigan.
So if we want to talk about law enforcement, I do want to bring up the question about the $1.8 billion Department of Justice piggy bank that Donald Trump wants to hand out to people who clearly broke our laws on January 6th. But I asked the question about gas prices because I happened to pump my gas just on Memorial Day. The worst part of my day was having to pay $82.89. Well, I thought about the fact that we lost more than a dozen service members in a war we never should have been fighting to raise those gas prices in the first place. If you want to talk about the rule of law, there are
Mr.
plenty
Syed,
of opportunities for us to talk about that.
I appreciate your position,
and
I will summarize it for the audience. You are opposed to the war in Iran, and you do not like the current gas prices. But Mr. Syed, we had a very friendly exchange last week. No, you're not answering my question. Is the entire point. You're pivoting to talking points. If you will talk to the question I asked, we can have an appropriate interview.
Let me finish my answer. $185 billion for ICE. That's $185 billion that are not being spent to improve anything from your infrastructure to your kid's school or to help you afford your health care. gas is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you do want to talk about ICE, let's talk about the opportunity cost of paying $185 billion into an agency that is currently sowing unrest in New Jersey, just like it did in Minneapolis.
What is
like
the cost to deny citizenship? Mr. Sayed, what is the cost to deny citizenship? What is the cost of violence on the street when you have criminals, murderers inside that Delaney Hall facility who you advocated, by the way, in a Facebook post to empty out the prisons that you think we should put effort into, invest in, and support the idea? I believe the direct quote is, I believe that any idea that gets people out of jail should be supported. And I'm talking about the cost you're imposing on society.
Whether or not this system is actually making people any safer. Ask yourself, do you feel safer now pumping your gas? Do you feel safer now in your neighborhoods? Or do you feel less safe because you've got a $185 billion force that's answerable only to Donald Trump? Ask yourself about whether or not people
I think we know the answer to that question.
Should have felt any safer.
I think we know the answer to that question. I think you asked the parents of Jocelyn Nungaray, the parents of Laken Riley, whether or not they feel safer under Donald Trump's policies.
I don't think most people feel safer. I'm so sorry. But Will, if you want to have an honest conversation about the issue, we can do that. But if you just want to interrupt me when I'm answering your question, I just don't know what the value is.
Mr. Sayed, I want to have an honest conversation. I just wish you would answer my questions and not pivot to other talking points you want to have. Okay, that is my simple goal.
I just think it's important to see this in context.
I told you last week and I told you today, I want to give you appropriate time to have these conversations, but it requires two of us to talk on the same subject to have this conversation. Let's talk for a moment more about whether or not you are a moderate or you are extreme in your search for Senate in Michigan. You've been asked about it. I think everybody deserves to ask you about it and to hear your answer. You have campaigned with, on the same side, on the same stage, with someone who has not even pretended to be moderate, Hasan Piker, who has said he's okay with communism. He has said he, by the way, as well, thinks America deserved 9/11. Does Hasan Piker reflect your vision?
My vision is one where every American can afford their basic dignities and a good life. My vision is one where you get health care when you need it. My vision is one where our government is not wasting your taxpayer dollars, dropping bombs on other people's kids, and instead is investing in you and your own.
Okay.
Insofar as I share that with anybody, I share that with Hasan, I share that with you, if that's what you believe in. But I do think it's kind of crazy when you've had the likes of, I don't know, Donald Trump on this show. Donald Trump, who says he wants to grab people by certain body parts. Donald Trump, who wants to weaponize a paramilitary force against our Constitution itself. Do you agree with everything Donald Trump has said?
Okay, we'll move this conversation in a productive manner, okay? I understand you're for Medicaid for all. You referenced that there. I understand Medicare you're opposed to the war. That you are opposed to the war in Iran. You referenced that in your answer as well. So we can move those talking points out. The audience now knows that is what you stand for. But the idea that because I interview President Donald Trump is the same as you campaigning with Hasan Piker is absurd. You talk about platforming and cancellation. Those are not the same things as standing side by side with someone when you campaign. So you asked, now let me ask you, would you invite President Donald Trump on the stage with you? I think the answer you're going to give me is no, and you're going to tell me it's because you disagree.
I would love to be on the stage.
No, I'm not talking about debate. I'm not talking about debate.
You're playing on the stage with him.
You're playing a slick word game. I'm not talking about platforming and debating.
I'd like to be on the stage with Donald Trump.
I'm talking about standing side by side as you campaign with someone.
We would debate exactly the same issues that have to do with the answers to the questions.
Do you want Donald Trump to stand with you at a rally? Do you want him to stand with you at a rally? Do you want his endorsement?
No.
Okay, then why do you want that from Hasan Piker?
Because I don't believe in that basic worldview. Because I don't believe that Donald Trump believes in the same worldview that I just shared with you.
But Hasan Piker does.
The healthcare they need.
But Hasan Piker does.
He's a lot more for giving people health care and not fighting.
Do you believe America deserved 9/11?
Donald Trump has started them for the last 3 weeks. No, of course I don't. That's ridiculous. First of all, ridiculous question. Because here's this game. This is why people hate the media. This is why they hate the media. Because you play this gotcha game. Because he said something one time, you think I automatically believe that. Now,
if you campaign with him, if you campaign with him. You're acting like you have a social acquaintance or you debated him. You campaigned with him. That's different, Mr. Sayed. You have the people need to know if what you preach is Medicare for all, but what you secretly believe is that America deserved 9/11.
If you want to have an honest conversation, we can have an honest conversation. I answered the question for you. But the idea that somehow you're going to try and take some words out of context and say that that's automatically what I believe to your audience is exactly why people don't believe you, Will.
No, you don't understand. I'm asking you a question.
I'm just saying that's where it comes from.
Okay, well, I would suggest to you, as you move forward.
You seem not to like my answer. You don't like the fact that I keep giving you the answers to the questions you really should be asking, which is, what is it that you want to do for the people in the state of Michigan?
You conduct a wonderful interview with yourself, Mr. Sayed.
I want to make sure that they can afford a living wage. I want to make sure that they got a union. I want to make sure
I understand those
positions.
Air,
drink clean water. But you're not asking me that. And when I asked you about whether or not you actually pump your own gas, you didn't answer the question. because you are so
I pump my own gas. We don't have any other way to do it in Texas. We don't have any other way to do it in Texas. How much did you pay for the last time? How much did you pay for your gas last time? I paid a lot. Gas prices are up right now, and every American is concerned about that.
And you are not asking me about that.
The question is whether or not Americans believe that war.
Okay. That you keep defending.
We're talking over each other. We're talking over each other consistently. And the reason is because we're having two separate conversations. Now, listen, you and I both know, and I'll tell the audience, I know your positions, and I've helped you forward some of those positions. I know you're opposed to the war in Iran. I know you're for Medicare for all. But you have other questions you have to answer. Last week, you and I texted, and you are still going to have an invitation on this show to have these long conversations. There'll be many people in the watching audience who do not appreciate that. But I think both the people who could vote for you, support you, and oppose to you need to understand where you are in deeper positions. And you have given plenty of reason for people to understand and question those things. I don't think you've answered those directly today, but I'm always willing to continue to have that conversation with you. I truly am, Mr. Sayed.
Well, look, I would love that opportunity. In the future, ask me questions about what I want to do for people in the state of Michigan. But the gotcha game that we keep playing, it's why people are so frustrated with our politics right now.
Okay,
so
I will take that under advisement.
I'll
take that under advisement. If I could offer you under advisement as well.
What made this Fox News interview so important is that it exposed something Democrats almost never do successfully on conservative media platforms: refuse the framing completely. That's the key difference here. Usually when Democrats go on Fox News, they walk directly into the trap. The host asks a loaded question, the Democrat immediately starts defending themselves, apologizing, clarifying, retreating, or trying to sound reasonable to an audience that already assumes they're guilty. The entire structure of the interview becomes the Republican host controlling reality, while the Democrat tries desperately to survive inside that reality. Abdul El-Sayed refused to do that from the very first question. That's why Will Cain got visibly frustrated almost immediately. Because this interview stopped functioning the way Fox interviews are designed to function. The first major thing El-Sayed understood is that immigration is the emotional centerpiece of modern Republican politics. Not healthcare, not wages, not inflation, not housing, immigration. Fear is the engine. That's why the right spends so much time trying to convince Americans that immigrants are responsible for every social problem in the country. Crime? Immigrants. High rent? Immigrants. Low wages? Immigrants. Cultural anxiety? Immigrants. Economic frustration? Immigrants. The strategy depends entirely on keeping the public emotionally activated rather than materially focused. And what El-Sayed did repeatedly was drag the conversation back toward material reality. Every single time. That's why the $185 billion paramilitary force framing was so effective. Whether people agree with the wording or not, politically it forces a different question entirely. Instead of debating whether ICE raids are emotionally satisfying to conservatives, it asks, what are Americans actually getting for $185 billion? That changes the entire debate. Suddenly, immigration enforcement is no longer some abstract patriotic concept. It becomes a budget issue, an opportunity cost issue, a governance issue. That is devastating territory for Republicans because modern MAGA politics is unbelievably expensive while simultaneously pretending government spending is evil. That contradiction sits at the center of the entire movement. Republicans scream about debt, deficits, government waste, and socialism until it comes time to fund militarized border operations, mass deportation systems, endless wars, surveillance expansion, ICE expansion, police expansion, or tax cuts for billionaires. Then suddenly there's unlimited money available. Then deficits stop mattering. Then government spending becomes patriotic. And El-Sayed kept forcing the audience back to that contradiction. Healthcare or ICE? Infrastructure or ICE? Schools or ICE? Housing or ICE? Lower costs or ICE? That's a far more dangerous political conversation for Republicans than culture war outrage because it starts grounding politics in material outcomes instead of emotional panic. And you could see Will Cain trying over and over to pull the conversation back into fear territory because fear is where Fox News is strongest. That's why he immediately pivoted to violent criminals, Laken Riley, citizenship panic, lawlessness, the collapse of America. This is the modern conservative media formula in its purest form. If economics fail, pivot to fear. If policy fails, pivot to crime. If governance fails, pivot to identity panic. If none of that works, pivot to guilt by association.
And that last part became incredibly obvious during the Hasan Piker segment. Notice what happened there. Will Cain could not win the policy argument cleanly, so the conversation shifted into association attacks. Not what policies are wrong, but who have you stood beside? That's modern media politics in a nutshell. The point isn't to debate healthcare policy or immigration policy directly anymore. The point is to socially contaminate opponents by attaching them to the most controversial quote imaginable from someone adjacent to them. That's why Cain repeatedly tried to force El-Sayed into defending every sentence Hasan Piker has ever said. But the hypocrisy became impossible to ignore because the exact same standard instantly collapses when applied to Republicans. Donald Trump has 34 felony convictions. Trump openly bragged about sexual assault. Trump has praised dictators. Trump attempted to overturn an election. Trump dined with white nationalists. Trump regularly posts inflammatory rhetoric.
Yet somehow, every conservative media figure who platforms him is magically exempt from guilt by association. That's the double standard El-Sayed was pointing directly at. And honestly, that's why the interview became so uncomfortable for Fox News. Because once you apply Republican standards equally, the entire structure falls apart. If appearing with Hasan means you secretly endorse every statement Hasan has ever made, then interviewing Trump would logically mean endorsing Trump's statements too. Fox cannot survive under that standard because conservative media itself is built around proximity to Trump. And this gets to the deeper issue underneath the whole segment. Republican media increasingly struggles to discuss governance itself. Notice how little actual governing was discussed from Will Cain's side. There was almost nothing about healthcare systems, nothing about wage stagnation, nothing about housing affordability, nothing about childcare, nothing about corporate consolidation, nothing about labor power, nothing about prescription drug prices. Because modern MAGA politics is not fundamentally organized around solving those issues. It's organized around emotional identity maintenance. That's why El-Sayed repeatedly frustrated Cain by returning to costs, wages, gas prices, healthcare, and infrastructure. He kept dragging politics back into the realm of material governance, while Cain kept trying to return to symbolic cultural conflict. And honestly, this is one of the biggest strategic lessons Democrats still haven't fully learned. Republicans often win media battles not because their policies are more popular, but because they successfully control the emotional framing of discussions. Democrats spend too much time accepting conservative framing and then trying to carefully explain themselves inside it. El-Sayed didn't do that. He interrupted the frame itself. That's why conservatives online were so angry afterward, not necessarily because every viewer suddenly agreed with him, but because he disrupted the normal hierarchy of a Fox News interview. The Republican host was supposed to dominate the structure. The Democrat was supposed to defend themselves. Instead, El-Sayed forced Will Cain onto defense multiple times.
And perhaps the most revealing part of the entire segment was the very end. El-Sayed says, I want to talk about healthcare. I want to talk about affordability. I want to talk about clean water. I want to talk about unions. That line matters because it exposes the core divide in modern American politics. Most ordinary Americans are exhausted financially. Housing is brutal. Healthcare costs are brutal. Childcare costs are brutal. Groceries are brutal. Wages have not kept pace with productivity for decades. Young people increasingly feel locked out of stable adulthood entirely. And yet massive portions of American media discourse remain trapped inside endless outrage cycles about immigrants, college protests, pronouns, culture wars, and fear narratives. That disconnect is becoming harder and harder for people to ignore. Because eventually, voters start asking, why is every political conversation about fear instead of my actual life? That's why moments like this resonate beyond one interview. Not because Abdul El-Sayed destroyed Will Cain in some flashy debate bro sense, but because he demonstrated a different style of political communication entirely. One where Democrats stop acting terrified of conservative framing and start aggressively redirecting conversations toward economic priorities and governance outcomes. Whether Democrats broadly adopt that strategy or not is another question entirely. But this interview showed very clearly why so many voters are exhausted with political media right now. One side keeps trying to discuss material conditions. The other side keeps trying to escalate emotional panic. And the more financially unstable ordinary life becomes in America, the harder it gets to sustain politics purely through fear alone.